missing for 72 hours, deep in the Vietnamese jungle, and an American female soldier's fight for survival had begun. But Emma Mitchell wasn't waiting to be rescued. She was planning to escape. And there was one thing she hadn't factored into her plan: the courage of an 8-year-old Vietnamese child who would save her life. This is a story about two warriors who found each other in hell and walked out together. Emma Mitchell's story begins with every soldier's worst nightmare: a communications specialist captured during what should have been a routine reconnaissance mission. Welcome to her 72-hour hell. But this isn't just another prisoner story. This is a story of two females, one American soldier, one orphan Vietnamese child, saving each other against impossible odds. What about you? In your darkest moment, would you recognize help coming from the most unexpected place? The morning had started like any other at Firebase Alpha. The scent of diesel fuel mixed with rain-soaked canvas as soldiers went about their routines. Staff Sergeant Emma Mitchell, 25 years old from Oklahoma, was preparing for what Intel had classified as a routine patrol. Those two words that every veteran knows are never really routine. Emma wasn't just another communications specialist. She was a volunteer, the one who raised her hand when others hesitated. Growing up on her father's farm, she'd learned to fix radios before she could properly drive a tractor. Her call sign was Nightingale. Not because she sang, but because her voice was often the last thing wounded soldiers heard before rescue arrived. That October morning in 1968, her team was tasked with establishing a forward observation post near the village of Ban Lac. Intelligence suggested minimal enemy activity. Intelligence was wrong. The ambush came at 0800 hours, just as morning mist began lifting from the jungle canopy. The distinctive crack of AK-47 shattered the peaceful dawn. Emma's team scattered, following protocol, but a second group of fighters had been waiting in the trees behind them. Specialist Rodriguez fell first, then Corporal Chun. Emma managed to get off a brief radio transmission. Nightingale down, grid 341 to 752, taking heavy fire, before shrapnel from a grenade knocked her unconscious. She woke up bound and blindfolded in the back of an ox cart, bouncing along jungle trails that seemed to lead deeper into hell. When the blindfold came off, Emma found herself in a place that defied every rule of war she'd been taught. This wasn't a prisoner of war camp. This was something else entirely. Ban Lac village sat in a clearing surrounded by triple canopy jungle, accessible only by foot trails that wound through terrain so dense that helicopters couldn't land within 5 kilometers. The village itself looked normal enough, maybe 40 residents, mostly women, children, and elderly men. Cooking fires, vegetable gardens, children playing with sticks. But something was wrong. The villagers moved with the careful deliberation of people living under constant threat. Their eyes followed Emma, but never met her gaze. They spoke in whispers. Duc Tran wasn't what Emma expected in an enemy commander. He was educated, spoke decent English, and wore a mixture of military gear and civilian clothes. But his eyes held the hollow look of a man who'd lost everything that mattered. "Staff Sergeant Emma Mitchell," he said, reading from her dog tags as she sat tied to a post in the center of his makeshift headquarters, a bamboo hut that had been reinforced with sandbags and camouflage netting. Communications specialist. Very valuable. Emma kept her expression neutral. Name, rank, serial number. That was all she was required to give. "You know," Tran continued, settling into a chair across from her, "I studied engineering at Saigon University before the war. I had plans. A wife, 2 children." His voice carried no emotion, just stating facts. "Your people killed them during a bombing raid on what you called a strategic target. It was a school." Emma felt something cold settle in her stomach. This wasn't going to be a normal interrogation. "I'm not interested in your military secrets," Tran said. "I'm interested in justice. My men have suggestions about how to achieve that justice through gaps in the bamboo walls." Emma could see Tran's fighters, maybe a dozen men who moved like soldiers but wore no uniforms. Their weapons were a mixture of captured American equipment and Soviet-supplied arms. These weren't regular troops following orders. These were men who'd chosen this path personally. For 3 days, Emma endured what military training never really prepares you for. Not just physical pain, but the systematic attempt to break down everything you believe about yourself, your mission, your worth as a human being. But Emma Mitchell had grown up on an Oklahoma farm during the Dust Bowl years. Her grandmother used to say, "When the storm comes, you don't fight the wind. You find shelter and wait for it to pass." Emma found her shelter in memories. Her father teaching her to repair radios, her mother singing while she cooked dinner, the promise she'd made to come home. On the second night, as she sat tied in that stifling bamboo prison, Emma became aware that someone was watching her. Not her guards. She always knew where they were. Someone else. Her name was Lynn, though Emma wouldn't learn that for another day. 8 years old, barely 3 feet tall, with hair so black it seemed to absorb light. She moved through the village like a ghost, present but never acknowledged, needed but never welcomed. Lynn had been orphaned 6 months earlier when government forces and Viet Cong fighters had turned her village into a battlefield. Her parents, simple farmers who tried to stay neutral in a war that didn't allow neutrality, had died in their sleep when a mortar round landed on their home. The survivors had scattered, and Lynn had ended up in Ban Lac not because anyone wanted her there, but because 8-year-old children don't survive alone in the jungle. The villagers fed her scraps, let her sleep in empty corners, and mostly pretended she didn't exist. But Lynn was invisible in a way that only children can be, and invisible children see everything. She watched trans men. She learned their routines, their weaknesses, their fears. She saw how they treated the American woman, and something in her young heart recognized a kindred spirit. Another person alone in a hostile world, surviving on pure stubborn will. On Emma's third morning of captivity, Lynn made a decision that would change both their lives forever. It started with water. Emma hadn't had a drink in 12 hours, and the tropical heat was taking its toll. Her lips were cracked. Her throat felt like sandpaper. She was beginning to hallucinate, seeing her father's farm where there should have been jungle, hearing her mother's voice in the wind. That's when a small hand appeared through a gap in the bamboo wall, holding a coconut shell filled with clean water. Emma drank gratefully, not caring where it came from. But when she tried to see her benefactor, all she caught was a glimpse of dark hair disappearing into the village chaos. The water came again that evening, and with it, a small portion of rice wrapped in banana leaves. Emma ate slowly, conserving her strength, beginning to hope that maybe someone in this place had a conscience. On the fourth morning, though Emma had lost precise track of time, Tran entered her prison with an ultimatum. "Your rescue team is coming," he said without preamble. "Our scouts report helicopters and ground forces moving toward this area. You will help us set an ambush, or you will die before they arrive." Emma looked at him steadily. "I won't help you kill my people." Tran nodded as if he'd expected this answer. "Then you are no longer useful to us." He turned to leave, then paused. "My men have personal grudges against Americans. I will not be able to control them much longer. Last chance." Emma closed her eyes. She'd known this moment would come. In her mind, she said goodbye to Oklahoma, to her parents, to the life she'd never get to live. But that's when she heard the voice outside, small, young, speaking rapidly in Vietnamese. Tran's response was sharp, annoyed. The voice persisted. Through the bamboo, Emma saw her, child who'd been bringing water and food. She was speaking urgently to Tran, pointing toward the jungle, gesturing with her hands. Tran's expression shifted from annoyance to alarm. The conversation grew heated. Emma couldn't understand the words, but body language is universal. The child was insisting on something. Tran was refusing. Other voices joined in, his men, some villagers. Then Emma heard it, a distant sound that every soldier in Vietnam knew by heart. The distinctive thrum of helicopter rotors cutting through jungle air. Her people were coming. What happened next would be talked about in military briefings for decades, though most of the details will remain classified. Tran burst back into Emma's prison, his earlier calm replaced by barely controlled panic. Behind him came 2 of his lieutenants, both carrying weapons and wearing the expressions of men who'd been given orders they were eager to carry out. "Your friends arrived sooner than expected," Tran said, drawing his pistol, "but they will find only a corpse." Emma closed her eyes and began reciting the Lord's Prayer, the way her grandmother had taught her. But instead of the expected gunshot, She heard a crash, the sound of ceramic shattering against bone. Opening her eyes, she saw Tran stumbling backward, blood streaming from a gash on his forehead. Behind him stood Lin, still gripping the handle of what had been a large water jar. The little girl's dark eyes blazed with determination that belonged on someone 10 times her age. "Go," Lin whispered in broken English, darting forward to work at the ropes binding Emma's hands. "Soldiers come. Must go now." Emma felt the ropes loosen. Her hands free for first time in 4 days. She grabbed Tran's dropped pistol and checked the chamber. Loaded. She could hear shouts outside as Tran's men realized something was wrong. "Come with me," Emma said, extending her hand to Lin. The child hesitated for just a moment, looking around the only home she'd known for months. Then she placed her small hand in Emma's calloused palm, and together they ran toward the back of the hut. Emma used but a Tran's pistol to smash through the bamboo wall, creating an opening just large enough for them to squeeze through. Behind them, she could hear Tran groaning back to consciousness, shouting orders to his men. The jungle behind Ban Lac village was a green maze of vines, thorns, and shadows. Under normal circumstances, Emma would have been helpless. She was a communications specialist, not a jungle warfare expert. But Lin moved through the vegetation like she was born to it, finding paths that were invisible to adult eyes. They ran until Emma's lungs burned and her legs shook with exhaustion. The sound of helicopters grew louder, joined now by the distinctive chatter of automatic weapons. Her rescue team had engaged Tran's forces. Finally, Lin pulled Emma behind a massive fallen tree and pointed through the jungle toward a clearing visible in the distance. Through the gaps in the foliage, Emma could see American soldiers establishing a defensive perimeter. The familiar sight of green uniforms and M16 rifles that meant safety, meant home. But as Emma prepared to reveal herself, she felt Lin's small hand on her arm. The child was pointing back toward the village, where shadows moved between the trees. Some of Tran's men had escaped the initial assault and were now hunting through the jungle. They waited in absolute silence as enemy soldiers passed within arm's reach of their hiding place. Emma held Tran's pistol ready, while Lin remained perfectly motionless, her breathing so controlled that Emma could barely detect it. The child had learned to be invisible to survive, and now that skill was keeping them both alive. When immediate danger passed, they began moving again, always staying parallel to the American perimeter, but never approaching directly. Lin seemed to understand military tactics instinctively. Approach from an unexpected angle. Identify yourself clearly. Never make sudden movements around armed soldiers who've been in combat. When Emma finally stood up in that jungle clearing and called out, "Friendly American soldier coming in," the response was everything she dreamed during 4 days of hell. Sergeant First Class Williams emerged from concealment, his weapon scanning the jungle behind Emma, while his radio crackled with urgent communications. "We've got her, Colonel. Mitchell is alive and mobile. Repeat, Nightingale is secure." Emma stumbled forward, her legs finally giving out as 4 days of adrenaline and terror caught up with her. Strong hands caught her. Medic Corporal Johnson, someone she'd served with for 8 months. "Easy, Emma," Johnson said, his voice thick with relief and barely controlled emotion. "We've got you. You're safe now." But Emma's attention wasn't on her own condition. She turned to look for Lin and saw the little girl hanging back at the edge of the clearing, her eyes wide with terror at the sight of so many armed soldiers. In her young life, men with guns had meant only death and destruction. "Wait," Emma called out, struggling to her feet despite Johnson's attempts to keep her down. "She saved my life. The little girl, she saved my life." Colonel Patricia Hayes, who had insisted on personally leading the rescue operation, approached Emma with a mixture of relief and concern etched on her weathered face. Hayes was a veteran of 2 tours, a commander who'd lost too many good soldiers to leave anyone behind. "Sergeant Mitchell," Hayes said, her voice carefully controlled, "we need to get you to a medical facility immediately. You've been through trauma that dash." "Colonel," Emma interrupted, pointing to where Lin still stood at the forest's edge, small and vulnerable among the giants in green combat gear. "The girl has no family. She helped me escape when everyone else had given up on me. She can't stay here." Hayes looked from Emma to the small Vietnamese child who had somehow become part of this rescue operation. The little girl was clearly malnourished. Her clothes were nothing more than rags held together with hope, and there was something in her dark eyes that spoke of losses no child should have to endure. Military protocol was crystal clear about such situations. American forces were not in the business of collecting refugees, especially not enemy nationals from contested areas. But Hayes had been a soldier long enough to know that sometimes regulations existed to be broken by people brave enough to do the right thing. "Sergeant, the complications alone dash." "Please, Colonel," Emma said, her voice gaining strength despite her physical exhaustion. "I'm not asking as a soldier following orders. I'm asking as a human being who owes her life to an 8-year-old child with more courage than most grown men I've served with." There was a long moment of silence as Hayes weighed duty against conscience, protocol against humanity. Around them, the sounds of jungle warfare were fading as Tran's remaining forces either surrendered or melted back into green maze they'd emerged from. "Johnson," Hayes finally said, "get them both to the evac chopper. We'll sort out the paperwork when we're back on friendly ground." The flight back to Firebase Alpha passed in a blur of medical attention and radio chatter. Emma drifted in and out of consciousness as the medical team worked to assess her condition: dehydration, multiple contusions, psychological trauma that would take months to properly evaluate. But every time she opened her eyes, she saw Lynn sitting beside her stretcher, the little girl's hand clasped tightly in her own. Neither of them spoke, Emma because her throat was too raw, Lynn because she was too overwhelmed by the rush of events. But their grip on each other never loosened. The real work began 3 weeks later, at the 24th Evacuation Hospital in Long Bin. Emma had been declared physically fit for limited duty, but the psychological evaluation was more complex. Combat stress reaction, the doctors called it, what would later be known as PTSD. Dr. Captain Sarah Martinez, the base psychiatrist, was a no-nonsense woman from New Mexico who'd seen too many young soldiers broken by a war that seemed to have no clear purpose or end. "How are you sleeping?" she asked during Emma's first formal session. "When I sleep," Emma replied honestly, "I dream about bamboo walls and the sound of helicopters that never come close enough. That's normal after captivity trauma." "What about the child?" And Emma's expression softened immediately. "She's incredible. Stronger than someone so young should have to be. She's learning English like it's a game, picks up new words every day. And Emma paused, searching for words to describe something that defied easy explanation. "She what, Sergeant?" "She's healing me as much as I'm helping her. Maybe more. When I have nightmares, she brings me water and sits with me until I can breathe normally again. When she has nightmares, and she has them too, I tell her stories about Oklahoma, about wide open spaces where you can see for miles and nobody's shooting at anybody." Dr. Martinez made notes. "Have you considered what happens when you rotate home? The adoption process for a Vietnamese national is complex." Emma had thought about little else. International adoption laws, immigration procedures, military regulations that didn't account for children rescued from war zones by soldiers who'd grown to love them like their own flesh and blood. "Colonel Hayes is helping navigate the bureaucracy," Emma said, "and I've written my parents. My father says any child brave enough to save his daughter's life has a place at our dinner table for as long as she wants it." 6 months later, the paperwork was complete. Staff Sergeant Emma Mitchell was granted early discharge on medical grounds. Not because she was unfit for duty, but because the Army recognized that sometimes healing requires a different kind of service. The flight from Tan Son Hut Airport to Travis Air Force Base in California was Lynn's first time in an airplane. She pressed her face to the window during takeoff, watching Vietnam disappear beneath the clouds with eyes that held both sadness and anticipation. Emma held her hand throughout the 14-hour flight, pointing out clouds and explaining what they would see in America. Not the America of war movies or government propaganda, but the real America of small towns and county fairs, of people who help their neighbors and believe that anyone could build a better life if they work hard enough. Today, more than 50 years later, Dr. Lynn Mitchelton runs a trauma counseling center in Tulsa, Oklahoma. The little girl who saved an American soldier's life in a Vietnamese jungle speaks perfect English, holds a PhD in clinical psychology, and has dedicated her life to helping other survivors of war and violence. Her office walls are decorated not with diplomas or awards, but with photographs. Pictures of the families she's helped heal, the children she's guided through their own nightmares, the veterans who found peace after decades of carrying invisible wounds. But the most prominent photograph sits on her desk. A picture of two women standing in front of a small farmhouse, their arms around each other, both smiling with the easy affection of mother and daughter, family by choice rather than blood. Emma Mitchell, now 77, still lives on that Oklahoma farm where she grew up. She never married, never had biological children, but she raised a daughter who became a healer, who transformed her own childhood trauma into a lifelong mission to help others find hope in their darkest moments. People ask me if I regret going to Vietnam. Emma says from her front porch, watching Lynn's children, her grandchildren, play in the same fields where she learned to fix radio 6 decades ago. I tell them that war is always a tragedy. But sometimes, in the middle of tragedy, you find something so precious that it transforms everything that came before. Lynn, now a grandmother herself, brings Emma a cup of coffee every morning before heading to work. They don't talk much about Vietnam anymore. Those conversations happened decades ago, in therapy sessions and late-night talks that help both of them process experiences that no training manual ever prepared them for. But sometimes, when storms roll across the Oklahoma plains and thunder reminds them both of distant artillery, they sit together on that porch and remember a different kind of courage. Not the courage of soldiers charging into battle, but the courage of an 8-year-old child who chose to help a stranger, even when helping meant risking everything she had left in the world. This story isn't just about Vietnam. It's not just about war. It's about the moments when we choose to see the humanity in strangers, when we risk our own safety to help someone we owe nothing to, when we decide that love is stronger than fear. Emma Mitchell went to Vietnam as a soldier, seeking to serve her country. She came home as something more. She came home as a mother, forever changed by a child's courage. What about you? Have you ever encountered someone whose quiet bravery changed your life? Share your story in the comments below. And if stories of unexpected heroes and the families we choose inspire you, subscribe to hear more incredible human stories. Because sometimes the most powerful rescues happen when we least expect them, and sometimes the smallest hands carry the biggest hearts. From which city are you watching the story of survival, hope, and the family bonds that transcend war itself? Let us know in the comments. And remember, heroes come in all sizes, and love has no nationality. The courage of an 8-year-old girl in a Vietnamese jungle reminds us that hope can be found in the darkest places, and that sometimes the people who save us are the ones we never see coming.